Hey there, welcome to another Unafraid to Fail podcast episode where we encourage people who are afraid of failing to go out there, pursue your goals, and to try new things. My name is Michael Byron, and on this podcast, I'll be talking about some practical tips on how you can overcome self doubt. Now, I have here my notes with me to help us guide through this topic, and I hope that this podcast will help you to overcome those self doubts. All right, so let's get started. Now, personally, for me, I've been experiencing self doubt. I've had experiences of self doubt in the past, and they're just the worst at keeping you and stopping you from doing anything new or exciting. In my experience, when you have a new idea, when you have something fresh and exciting you want to pursue, the energy is like really high up. It's like whoop. But then self doubt comes in and it just tells you of all the ways it could go wrong. And then you're just filled and plagued with all this doubts and fears about yourself, about what other people will say to you, and why you wouldn't succeed, and why you should just quit while you're ahead, and all those things. And you can see your energy about your new idea just go down, down, down. And then you hit rock bottom and you end up being getting discouraged, not wanting to pursue that new idea, that new pursuit, that new goal that you want to have. So I've experienced that before, but I want to share with you some practical tips and insights on what I did to overcome that. Now, from personal experience, the most recent one I had about self doubt was probably when I started this podcast, which is ironic because Unafraid to Fail is supposed to be an encouraging place, right, for people who have self doubts and who are afraid of failing. But the story of how this podcast began started from the fear of failing. I had so many doubts as to why I shouldn't start a podcast, as to why I shouldn't even do this in the first place. And I'll share with you some of those doubts that I had before. But thanks to God's wisdom that He has given me, I was able to ask myself some deep questions that has allowed me to overcome those self-doubts. And I'll share them with you in a bit. But before we jump right into the practical things, I want to first quickly discuss about where these self-doubts come from. In my personal experience, my self-doubt comes from insecurities. It came from the parts of my life where I may have failed in the past and why I should probably not even do this because I failed before. What's the difference now? It comes from biases that I had about myself and about what other people would say about me. And mind you, these things are not even true. These are basically just assumptions, things that my mind made up to protect myself, I guess, from getting embarrassed or from hurting myself. But in the long run, it doesn't really help me grow and try new things. So it's such a strange thing because my mind is telling me no to protect me, but it's also keeping me from growing. And so we need to break from that. We need to be able to push through that so that when we break away from the fear and the doubts, we can experience the growth that we want to have. And so, some things that I've learned about these biases and these assumptions that I have in my brain is the fact that they're just biases and assumptions, and that what happened before may not apply to what would happen right now or in the future. Because honestly, nobody really knows exactly what's going to happen. Nobody knows what would happen if you got out there, pursued your music career, started a job, a new job, started a business, wrote a book. Nobody really knows what's going to happen. Only you would know. Only your actions and your mindset determine the outcome of your pursuit. And of course, trusting in God's wisdom for your life. Without His wisdom in your life, you're never going to be sure about anything. But with God's wisdom in your life, even when you're not personally sure, logically speaking, about anything, because God's wisdom is operating in your life, you can be sure that God will lead you to the right place and at the right time. I'm kind of going ahead of myself there. But the truth is, nobody really knows exactly what's going to happen until you do it. Nobody has 100% certainty of what's going to happen, but you just got to do it. That's the only way of knowing. So that was the mindset that I had when pursuing anything new. And even when I did this podcast thing, I told myself I won't really know what's going to happen with this podcast unless I do it. So that's the first thing, I guess. Nobody knows, only you will know. So do it. Just go out there and do it. You will be the one who can determine the outcome. All right. Third is this is kind of a hard thing to do for a lot of us, but it's something that I've learned during those times when I would have some serious issues about the worst that could happen. Like I would be so full of fear about what the worst thing would happen and just be consumed by that I would just totally stop from doing and pursuing anything. And that is such a bondage. It stops you from doing anything at all because you keep focusing on the worst thing that could happen. But again, it's just an assumption. And so what I've learned in the past is look at the worst. Don't be afraid of it. Just imagine, look at the worst thing that could possibly happen if you do it. Once you have that in your view, once you've seen the worst possible outcome, ask yourself, what can I do if that were to happen? Like, what are the things that I am able to do if that would happen? You can also ask yourself the other question, what are the things that I can't do if the worst thing were to happen? And try to really understand and imagine how it's going to affect you, how it's going to affect your family, and weigh the cost, weigh the options of what would happen. I can tell you from personal experience that most of the time, the things that we thought would be the worst possible outcome isn't that scary at all. And we realize that if it should happen, that there is something you can do about it, that there is something you can do to prepare if worst comes to worst. But again, who knows if that is going to but again, who knows if that's really going to happen? No one can know. And thankfully for us as Christians, we also have God's wisdom that can lead us and guide us so that we can prepare for even the worst possible thing. Or God's wisdom can lead us so that the worst thing doesn't happen. That's the power of faith and being a Christian. And so if you're not a Christian and if you don't have God in your life, I encourage you, seek Jesus, read through the Bible, find a good preacher and a pastor, and let them lead you to Christ. Because having Jesus in your life is one of the best things you can do to stop being fearful of failing. So that's the third thing. Look at the worst that could happen and really dig deep. And you'll find that it's not really that bad. You have things that you can do to prepare for it or to prevent it. And there are things that you just can't do, and you might be okay with it. But that's the third thing. So now let's go ahead and dig deep. I've written down here 4 questions that I asked myself in the moment that I had self-doubt, especially when I started this podcast. And I'll be sharing with you the questions that I asked myself that I had to dig deep until I found the answer. Hey guys, Future Ron here, and I just want to let you know that there's a free resource for this podcast in the description below. You can go ahead and download it so you can follow along this podcast. Now, let's get back to the show. So, let me share this with you. The first question is why I think I shouldn't do this. That was the first question. Why I think I shouldn't do this. Why do I think I shouldn't do this podcast? Now, in this portion of this question, I had to write down all the doubts I had about myself. I wrote down all the reasons why I think it would fail. I wrote down all the things that people would possibly say if I started this podcast, like all the negative things that they would say if I started this podcast. And I also wrote down my own insecurities, my own incapabilities, all the things that is keeping me from actually making this work. So I wrote it down in these questions. Why I think I shouldn't do this. I wrote down the doubts I had about myself, the reasons why I think it would fail, all the things that people would say about me, and I wrote down all my incapabilities and the reasons why it wouldn't work. So I'll read to you, it's kind of a personal thing, but I'll read to you some of the notes that I had um, when answering this question. So before I started this podcast, I asked myself, why I think I shouldn't do this podcast. So, first thing was podcasting is a lot of work, but it's simpler than making music. And so that was really something that I didn't want to do. I didn't want to do a lot of work because I have a full time job, and doing podcasting on top of my full time job is a lot of work. Secondly, I'm not sure if my thoughts hold answer. I, I'm not sure if my thoughts hold any water. In other words, I'm not sure if my thoughts were good enough. That's an insecurity. Next, I was scared if people wouldn't listen to me. What if my thoughts were actually pointless and useless? And what if people don't really care? That's a fear that I had before I started this podcast. Third, I'm scared that if I say something wrong, it would hurt somebody. And it's still something that gnaws into my head from time to time, but by God's grace, it has certainly calmed down. I'm scared to say something that wouldn't really help anyone. What if the things that I say here doesn't really help anybody? It's pointless, useless, you know. Um, Next, some insecurities that I had, reasons why I think I shouldn't do this. Am I interesting enough? Can I say something that's actually worth to anyone? I'm not an expert. I'm not experienced enough on different areas, you know? And then things about my voice, how it's not really pleasant sounding. It's not really that ASMR. Like it's not deep and crispy. It's not like manly. And I wrote all these down on why I think I shouldn't be doing this podcast. And to be honest with you, it was a bit of an eye opener to have this in my screen written down. And it's like, wow, it was like a sort of a self revelation on my part. Wow, I really have a lot of insecurities. I have a lot of fear about myself. And I don't know if they're legit fears, but I mean, these are based on my personal thoughts about myself, my own experiences. So these are biased. These are my assumptions about myself. So, but it's good to have it articulated because when you get to the second question, you'll be able to sort of put an answer to your first, sort of as a counter to your first. So the first question, why I think I shouldn't do this, is followed by the second question of why I think I should do this. Why do I think I should do this? So I started off first with some doubts, negativity. I had to face perhaps the real reasons, and be a realist for a second, really think why I think I shouldn't do this. And then I countered it with something more positive. Why I think I should do this. The reasons that are also real that would hopefully counter these insecurities and these doubts that I had in my mind. So I wrote here like I have the equipment, I have the skills to make a podcast. I've been featured in podcasts before, and to be honest to myself, and also from what I have received feedback from others, they say it's quite good. So that to me was like, oh, okay. So it's a boost of confidence. Like, oh, okay, there's actually something good. I may have forgotten about this, when I first wrote it down on the first question, but now on the second question, it came up to my mind like, oh yeah, I have done this before, and people kind of liked it. So that was really something that encouraged me. I continued. My thoughts may not hold much water, but I do know people who have been impacted about the things that I've said. So I know that maybe not all my thoughts may be, as legit or anything like that, but I have said things that have impacted people before and have changed their lives. So maybe I can share the same things as well during this podcast. And that gave me an idea. That gave me a reason as to why I think I should do this. Next, I do know people who have listened to me, and I have friends who also listen to me. So that was another encouraging thing. Um, Secondly, another thing is I've also learned how to say things without hurting people. In other words, I know how to be. I have already practiced how to become more tactful. Now, does that mean I'm never gonna be making that mistake again? No, but I've certainly grown and I've learned from my mistakes from before. So there's a lower chance now of making that again. Next, I may not be the most interesting guy in the world, but I do have experiences that will hopefully help people. Now, That, of course, is a bias and assumption on my part, but my thought, maybe, there's a high chance that maybe I'm not the most interesting guy. There's a high chance that I may not be the most interesting guy, but I do have experiences and thoughts that I think people would benefit from, you know? And again, it's a personal bias. I say that to myself, but perhaps other people find me interesting. I don't know. I don't really know. But again, it's a personal bias and it's an assumption about myself that I don't even know if it's true, So I just have to get out there and see, try it out, And if it's true, then okay, all right. And if it's not true, then okay, fine. I'm learning to be okay with that. Next, I'm not an expert in a lot of things, so this is like admitting to my insecurity from before. I may not be an expert on a lot of things, but this gives me all the more reason to do so because I can find people who can give me their own perspectives. So it was like an added bonus. Like, yeah, doing this podcast, I can invite people over to discuss about their experiences and I can gain insight from them. In doing so, I would be learning a lot, right? So I had to face the reality of the things where I was weak at, the things that I needed to work on, but I also saw the benefits of being able to do this, of doing this podcast. So that's the power of asking these two questions. So the first question again is why I think I shouldn't do this. You can ask that yourself. Why I think I shouldn't write a book. Why I think I shouldn't go to the gym. Why I think I shouldn't make music. Why I think I shouldn't start a business. And then secondly, things, reasons why you think you should. Reasons why you should pursue music. Why you should write that book. Why you should open that business. Why you should go to the gym. And you find that you'll have more reasons why that's going to benefit your growth and your life even more. It will outweigh the reasons why you should will outweigh the reasons why you shouldn't. And I think that gives you the push to go forward despite your fears and your doubts. The next part, the third question is other excuses. Now, after you've dug deep with the first two questions, the third question is what are your excuses? Now, these are the remaining thoughts that you might have in your head after digging deep, right? So you've dug deep on the first two questions, why you think you shouldn't do this and why you think you should. Now you got to ask yourself, what else? What other excuses do I have? And then write them down. For me, my other excuse was there are already so many people out there who have made podcasts like mine's before. So why should I do this? That was like the remaining question I had in my mind that after asking the deep questions. My excuse was people have done it before. Why should I do another one? You know? But then once you have that third question, the last question is the end of the line. This will help you to overcome the final doubt, the final boss of doubt that's in your mind. And I call it the end of the line question. Right? Well, it's not really a question, but more like, what will be your response to that excuse? So, in my, do I have any other excuse? My response to that was, there are so many people who have started out podcasts already. Why should I make one? The end of the line response that I had was, there's so many brands around the world, so many companies and businesses who provide basically the same sort of things, but each one stands out from the other. It doesn't matter if you've made a podcast like others before. You'll find a way to stand apart from others. God will give you wisdom. God will give you strength. He will equip you. So that was my response to my final excuse. The fact that even if there's so many podcasts that has been started on different topics and different genres and channels, but just like how there's so many businesses around the world, and yet each one stands out, I believe by God's grace, I'll find a way to make my own podcast stand out. And that was the end of the line. By the time I reached this final question or this final part of my digging deep, I already had my answer. I had no more reason why I shouldn't do this. As a matter of fact, I had all the more reason why I should, right? Now, if you can't answer the questions you had on the third, the reasons you had on the third question, which is what are your other excuses, then I encourage you, go and read the Bible or find a friend who will help you see a different perspective. Make sure your friend is also someone who can encourage you as well. But find a friend, could be your parent, perhaps a mentor, someone close to you. Get their perspective, get their insights, show them these things that you've written down. And I promise you, if they're a good friend, and if they're a friend full of wisdom, they will help you see. They will help you find a reason why you should. Or they'll give you insights on what you can do. So that maybe not now, but in the future you can. There's so many different ways that you can do this. There's not only one way, but in my experience, having these four guide questions really helped me. Now, another big part about help on how to help you answer this final question, the end of the line question, is to remind yourself of what God says in His Word. Going into this Word, digging deep in what He says, His promises towards you, and what He has done for you through Christ is important to encourage yourself. So I'm going to show you some of my favorite verses that reminds me of what God will do and what God has done. So in Psalms 1, for example, verse 1 to 3, blessed is the man who walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate day and night. And he shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that bringeth forth his fruit in his season. His leaf also shall not wither, and whatsoever he doeth shall prosper. So Psalms 1 clearly says, meditate on God's word. Let it be something that you have in your heart and in your mind. And you'll be like a tree planted in rivers of water, bearing fruit in its season. And whatever you do prospers. There's power when you meditate on God's word. Lastly, Joshua 1, verse 8 to 9. This book of the law shall not depart of thy mouth, but thou shalt meditate therein day and night. Similar to Psalms 1, right? Meditation. That thou mayst observe to do according to all that is written therein. For then thou shalt make thy way prosperous, and then thou shalt have good success. Why am I reading this KJV? It's so hard to read, but bear with me. So God says here, don't let my words depart from your mouth, but meditate on them day and night, and you'll find your way prosperous and you'll have good success. And then God says to Joshua in verse 9, have I not commanded thee? Be strong and be of good courage. Be not afraid, neither be dismayed. For the Lord thy God is with thee, whithersoever thou goest. The Lord God will be with you wherever you go. In whatever pursuit that you'll go, and whatever thing that you'll be doing, go to God's wisdom and to His word. You can never go wrong. God will be with you wherever you go. And so, those are my tips on how you can set yourself free from self doubt. If you have any sort of doubts or fears as to why you shouldn't do something, I hope that those four questions have helped you to discover going down deep to the roots and finding that at the end of the line, you'll have more reason to actually do it. So, to quickly recap, the four questions were why you think you shouldn't do it. The second one is why you think you should. The third one is what's your excuse? And finally, your end of the line. Now, all of these four questions will answer each other and will help you dig deep into the root to the root issues that you have in your heart. And will hopefully show you that these things that we have, these insecurities, these sort of excuses we've come up with within ourselves are just assumptions and biases. And nobody really knows exactly what's going to happen. Only you know. When you operate in God's wisdom, when you learn to trust in what He has said in His word, you'll find yourself that you'll have more reason to actually do it. You'll see God at work in your life when you step out in faith. I've said this in the previous podcast in episode 2. Fear is not the absence of courage, but rather it's faith acted out, even in the midst of fear. So when you get out there, when you do your thing, sure, you might still have some doubts and fears from time to time, but take that step of courage. Move out in faith that even if you might feel it, it's just a feeling, but know that the truth is God is with you and you can do it. You got this by God's grace. And so that concludes this podcast episode. I hope that this has been really helpful for you. And I hope that these 4 questions will serve you well in helping you to overcome your fears. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast. I hope this has been really helpful and has helped you to be unafraid to fail. I'll see you again next time. Thank you and God bless. Oh, before you go, I wanted to let you know, please, we already have. Oh, before you go, we already have an Instagram and you'll find all the reels of these podcasts. So instead of listening to the whole thing, you can find also snippets on our podcast on Instagram at Unafraid to Fail. The link will be below in the description. I'll see you guys there. God bless.